The first board of the porch groaned like a dying man. Ilara put her weight into the crowbar, her knuckles white, her breath misting in the crisp autumn air. The wood, seasoned by 50 years of sun and snow, resisted with the stubbornness of old trees. Beside her, Silas, a gray-muzzled dog whose ancestry was a matter of local speculation, lifted his head from his paws. His brown eyes, intelligent and patient, watched the strain in her shoulders. He did not whine or bark. He simply watched, a silent, furry witness to the beginning of the madness. The board gave way with a sharp crack, a sound that seemed to travel for miles in the still morning. Ilara tossed it aside and peered into the dark space beneath. It smelled of damp earth, of stone, of 100 sleeping seasons. "It'll work," she said, her voice a low murmur, not meant for anyone but the dog and the dirt. Silas gave a soft huff, a sound of canine agreement, and rested his head back on his paws. The work was slow. She spent the first week just removing the porch decking, numbering each board with a piece of charcoal so it could be returned to its proper place. The house, inherited from parents she barely remembered, stood isolated at the edge of Blackwood Creek, a town that held its breath between the first snowfall and the last spring thaw. Her father had been an engineer with ideas too large for the small town, and her mother a quiet woman who understood the language of herbs and clouds. They were gone now, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley 2 years prior, leaving Ilara with the house, a small savings, and a collection of leather-bound journals filled with her father's elegant, precise script. Mr. Abernathy was the first to stop. He was a man carved from the local timber, his face a roadmap of hard winters and harder opinions. He leaned on her fence, his hands calloused and thick. "Tearing up a perfectly good porch, Ilara?" he asked, his voice carrying the easy authority of age. "Rot underneath?" "No, sir," she replied, not looking up from her work. She was using a spade to break the compacted earth. "I have a plan." Abernathy spat a stream of tobacco juice near a stump. "A plan? Your father was always full of plans. Most of them stayed on paper." He squinted at the growing pile of dark soil beside the house. "What in God's name are you digging for? Treasure?" The question was a joke, but his tone was not humorous. "Shelter," she said simply. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was more of a bark. "You've got a house, girl, a fine one, built by my own grandfather. It stood through the blizzard of 48 and the ice storm of 62. What more shelter does a body need?" Ilara finally stopped and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and serious. "A better one." She turned back to her digging. The rhythm was all that mattered. Drive the spade, lift the earth, turn and dump. Repeat. Mr. Abernathy watched her for another full minute, the silence stretching between them. He shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "Wait until the ground freezes," he said, more to himself than to her. "That'll be the end of that foolishness." He walked away, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, she had one of her father's journals open on the small kitchen table. Silas slept at her feet, his leg twitching as he chased rabbits in his dreams. The page was covered in diagrams of air currents and thermal gradients. Her father had underlined a passage twice. "The earth breathes. Below the frost line, its temperature is constant. A structure that can tap into this breath, that can use the planet's own latent warmth, is not merely a shelter, it is a living thing. It does not fight the cold, it negotiates with it." He called it a geothermal lung, a deep, insulated chamber connected to the surface by carefully placed, baffled vents that would allow for air exchange without significant heat loss. One vent, he'd sketched, could be routed through the base of a chimney flue, creating a slow but constant convection that would draw the coldest, densest air out and pull stable, subterranean air in. The digging was brutal. Her hands, already calloused from gardening and chopping wood, blistered, then bled, then formed new, tougher layers of skin. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. She dug until dusk each day, hauling the earth out with a bucket and a rope, piling it neatly near the woods where she would later use it to berm the northern foundation of the house. She was creating a space roughly 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, aiming for a depth of 8 feet. The topsoil gave way to dense, red clay, which in turn gave way to shale that had to be broken with a pickaxe. The sharp ring of steel on stone became the metronome of her days. Mrs. Gable came by on a Wednesday, carrying a covered apple pie that was still warm. She was a kind woman whose concern was as thick and sweet as her molasses cookies. "Ilara, dear," she said, her eyes wide with worry as she took in the gaping hole under the porch. "Mr. Abernathy says you're digging a root cellar. But it's so deep, and you're all alone." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the pie." Ilara wiped her muddy hands on her trousers. "It's not proper work for a young woman," Mrs. Gable fretted, twisting a corner of her apron. "You'll catch your death of cold. You should be inside, thinking about finding a husband, not this." She gestured vaguely at the pit. "I have a plan," Ilara said again. The phrase was becoming her shield. Mrs. Gable sighed, the sound of a gentle breeze giving up against a stone wall. "Your parents, God rest their souls, they were always a bit different. But this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. What happens when the snows come? This whole thing will fill up and freeze solid. It'll crack your foundation." "It won't," Ilara said. She offered no explanation. She knew it would be useless. They saw a hole. She saw a system. They saw madness. She saw her father's careful calculations. The town's wealthiest resident, Mr. Sterling, who owned the lumber mill and half the businesses on Main Street, drove by in his polished black automobile. He slowed, rolled down his window, and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that made Silas bristle. "Heard you were digging to China, Ilara," he called out. "Let me know if you find any gold." He drove off, still chuckling. She ignored them all. Their words were wind. The earth was real. The ache in her muscles was real. Her father's journals were real. She lined the excavation with a thick layer of gravel for drainage, a detail her father had insisted was critical. Then came the framing. She bought heavy timbers from a collapsed barn at the edge of town, paying the farmer a few dollars for the right to haul them away herself. She used a block and tackle rigged to an old oak tree, with Silas watching her every move, to lower the massive beams into the pit. Her joinery was precise, learned from years of watching her father in his workshop. She fitted the beams together, creating a subterranean skeleton that felt as solid as the mountain itself. One section, directly beneath the front steps, she designed differently. It was shallower, only 4 feet deep, but connected to the main chamber by a wide, low opening. This was the wood box. She lined it with fieldstone and installed 2 small hooded vents that exited discreetly behind the porch lattice. These vents, according to her father's drawings, would draw the dry, stable air from the main chamber and circulate it gently through the stacked wood. By late October, the primary structure was complete. She insulated the ceiling, the underside of her porch, with thick layers of wool batting sealed in oilcloth. She relayed the numbered porch boards, their familiar groans now a comforting sound. From the outside, her house looked exactly as it always had, except for the new, neatly stacked pile of dirt by the woods and two small, almost invisible vent covers. The entrance was a heavy, insulated trapdoor she'd built into the floor of the back pantry. Liam, the blacksmith's son, came to deliver a new set of hinges she'd ordered for the trapdoor. He was quiet like her, with hands that were stained with soot but surprisingly gentle. He didn't look at the house with pity or amusement. He looked at it with a craftsman's eye. "That's a lot of earth moved," he said, nodding toward the pile. "It is," Ilara agreed. He set the heavy iron hinges on the porch. "Heard you were building a cellar." "Something like it." His eyes drifted to the wood she was stacking in the space under the steps, accessed by a small door she'd built into the lattice. He knelt, peering inside. "How are you planning to keep that dry? Any space under a porch is damp as a dish rag." "It has ventilation," she said. He reached a hand inside, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held it there for a moment. "The air, it feels different. Not cold, not wet." He looked at her, his curiosity genuine. "How?" "It's connected to a deeper chamber. It uses the ground temperature." He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He just nodded slowly. "Clever," he said. "Very clever." He looked at her hands, at the calluses and the faint, healing scars. "That's hard work." "It needed to be done," she said. The first test came in early November, a week of cold, persistent rain that soaked the entire valley. The world was shades of gray and brown. Smoke from the town's chimneys hung low and heavy. Everyone's wood piles, even those covered by tarps, were dark with moisture. People complained of hissing, sputtering fires that gave more smoke than heat. On the fourth day of the rain, Mr. Abernathy walked past her house again, his collar turned up against the drizzle. He stopped, his gaze fixed on her porch. Ilara was on her knees, pulling a few logs from the understep storage. He watched her carry an armload of split oak to her door. The wood was pale and obviously, impossibly, dry. He could see it from the fence. He saw her go back for a second load. Not a single piece was darkened by damp. He didn't say a word. He just stood there in the rain for a long time, watching her house. The closed loop of his certainty had been broken. A question had entered it. He turned and walked back toward town, his steps slower than before. The snows began a week before Christmas. They were light at first, a gentle dusting that decorated the pines and softened the hard edges of the world. But the old-timers felt something different in the air. The cold was deeper, more piercing than usual. The wind had a meaner edge to it. Ilara spent her days stocking her subterranean shelter. She filled shelves with jars of preserved vegetables from her summer garden, sacks of flour and beans, tins of salted meat, and dozens of candles. She ran a small, insulated stovepipe from the main chamber up along the back of her house, a secondary flue that could be used for a small wood stove if the need arose. The main source of warmth, however, was meant to be the earth itself. The temperature inside the bunker held at a steady 52 degrees, no matter how cold it got outside. It was chilly, but it was a survivable chill, a stark contrast to the deathly cold that was beginning to grip the valley. The great blizzard of '88 did not arrive. It descended. It fell out of a sky the color of slate and buried the world in a fury of white. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. By nightfall, the snow was a foot deep and the wind was howling, a physical presence that shook the little house to its foundations. Ilara brought Silas inside, bolted the door, and lit the lamps. She kept the fire in the hearth roaring, but she could feel the cold seeping through the walls, through the very timber of the house. The windows rattled. A fine, glittering powder of snow was being driven through invisible cracks around the sashes. By Wednesday morning, the world outside her windows was gone. There was only a swirling, blinding vortex of white. The sound of the wind was a constant, high-pitched scream. She went to the pantry and lifted the heavy trapdoor. A wave of cool, still, earthy-smelling air rose to meet her. It felt like a different planet. "Come on, boy," she said to Silas. He followed her down the sturdy wooden steps into the quiet dark. She lit 2 oil lamps, their soft glow pushing back the shadows. The silence was the first thing she noticed. Down here, the screaming of the wind was a distant, muffled whisper, like the memory of a storm. It was cool, but the air was dry and still. There was no draft. There was no seeping, life-stealing cold. She checked a thermometer she'd hung on a post. 51 degrees. Outside, it was likely 20 below zero, with a wind chill that would freeze exposed skin in seconds. She sat on a small cot she'd set up, running her hand over Silas's thick fur. "It works," she whispered into the quiet. "He was right." They spent 2 days down there. She had food, water, light, and blankets. She would climb the steps every few hours to check on the house. The upstairs was frigid. The water in the kitchen bucket had frozen solid. The snow was piled halfway up the windows. But the house was holding. And down below, they were safe. On the 3rd day, the wind lessened its assault, though the snow still fell thick and heavy. In a moment of quiet, she heard a sound, a desperate, frantic pounding. It wasn't at the door, it was on the wall of the house itself. She climbed the steps, Silas at her heels, and unbolted the back door. It wouldn't budge. A drift of snow, packed as hard as concrete, held it fast. The pounding came again, this time on the front door. She fought her way through the frozen kitchen, her breath pluming. The front of the house was more sheltered from the wind. With a great effort, she managed to pull the door inward. A figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled and fell into her hallway. It was Liam. His face was rimmed with ice, his lips blue. "Alara," he gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My roof, part of it's gone. The snow, it's inside. My fire's out." "Come," she said, her voice calm. She helped him up. He was shivering so hard he could barely stand. "I saw your chimney smoke," he stammered. "It's the only one I could see." She hadn't been using the main fireplace. She'd lit the small stove in the bunker, its flue a thin, efficient pipe that rose up the sheltered side of the house, less visible but more effective. She didn't take him to the cold main room. She led him straight to the pantry, opened the trapdoor, and guided him down the steps into the lamplit stillness. He stopped at the bottom, his eyes wide with disbelief. He held out his bare hands, feeling the air. The violent shivering began to subside. "What is this place?" he breathed. "Shelter," she said. An hour later, once Liam was wrapped in blankets and sipping hot tea she'd brewed on the small stove, they heard another shout from outside. Liam, stronger now, helped her clear the front door again. It was Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of terror. Her chimney had collapsed, filling her small house with smoke and snow. She was half frozen. They brought her down into the warmth and the quiet. She sat on a crate, weeping with relief. She looked around the chamber, at the neat shelves, the sturdy beams, the dry stone floor. She looked at Alara. She didn't say anything. She just shook her head, her eyes full of a dawning, shattering understanding. Before the day was out, they came for Mr. Abernathy. His son had fought his way through the drifts. The old man was stubborn, but his windows had blown in on the north side of his house, and his firewood was buried under 6 feet of snow. He was trying to burn his furniture to stay alive. When he descended the steps into Ilara's shelter, he paused and looked at the massive beams supporting the ceiling. He ran a hand over the smooth, planed surface of one. He looked at the ventilation shafts, now faintly whistling as they did their work. He understood the mechanics of it instantly. He looked at Ilara, his face grim. "You did this yourself?" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Your father's plans?" "Yes." He sat down heavily on a sack of flour. He didn't say he was sorry, not yet. But his entire being radiated a profound and grudging respect. The last to arrive was Mr. Sterling. His large modern house on the hill, with its huge picture windows and electric heat, was a frozen tomb. The power lines had been down for days. His pipes had burst. He and his wife arrived in a state of shock, humbled and freezing, their fine coats doing little to stop the invasive cold. He stared at the simple, functional space that a young woman had dug with a spade and a pickaxe. His booming laughter was a distant memory. Here, in the quiet heart of the earth, his money meant nothing. Ilara's foresight meant everything. For 4 more days, the 13 people of Blackwood Creek who had reached Ilara's house lived in the bunker. They shared the food. They drank melted snow. They huddled in the steady, life-preserving cool. They listened to the storm rage above them, a beast trying to claw its way in. But the shelter held. The earth held them. Ilara's plan held them. When the storm finally broke, the world was silent and new. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible white. The snow was piled to the rooftops in places. They had to tunnel their way out of the house. The town of Blackwood Creek was gone, buried. It would take weeks to dig out. Several houses had collapsed. Many more were unlivable. But the 13 people who had taken refuge in the bunker were alive. In the weeks that followed, the story of Ilara's shelter became a local legend. The men of the town, led by a silent and determined Mr. Abernathy, helped her expand it. They dug a second chamber, reinforced the first, and installed a better ventilation system based on her father's more detailed schematics. Mr. Sterling paid for all the materials, the finest timber from his mill and hardware from the city, delivered by the first sleighs that could get through. He never mentioned money to Ilara. The deliveries just appeared. It was his form of apology. One evening, as spring was finally beginning to assert itself, Mr. Abernathy came to her porch. He held his worn hat in his hands. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet. "I was a fool. What you did here, it's the smartest damn thing I've ever seen." He looked out at the valley, still patched with snow but showing the first hints of green. "Your father was a smart man, but he just wrote it down. You built it." He met her eyes. "You saved us." "We saved each other," Ilara said. The bunker became a permanent fixture of the town, known officially as the Blackwood Creek Shelter. Ilara, with Liam at her side, taught the other townsfolk how to read the land, how to understand the principles of geothermal building, how to prepare. They didn't just rebuild their town. They rebuilt it better, smarter. Her father's journals, once the source of private obsession, became a public textbook for survival. Liam and Ilara married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony on the porch of the house that stood above the shelter. Their life together was like the structure Ilara had built, quiet, solid, and deep. Years passed. The winter of the Great Blizzard became a landmark in time, a story told to wide-eyed children. The shelter was used twice more in Ilara's lifetime, once during a flash flood that turned the creek into a raging river, and once during a forest fire that forced the entire town to take refuge from the smoke and heat. Each time, it held. Silas grew old. His muzzle turned completely white, and his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping by the fire in winter, or on a cool patch of dirt under the porch in summer. One cool autumn evening, 16 years after the blizzard, he lay his head on Ilara's lap as she sat on the hearth. He gave a soft sigh, a gentle release of breath, and was still. She felt the life pass from him, a quiet fading. Liam helped her bury him the next morning on the small hill behind the house, overlooking the valley. They placed a simple field stone at the head of the grave. Ilara carved a single word into it: witness. Liam passed a decade after that, his heart giving out while he was splitting wood. Ilara buried him next to Silas. She lived on alone in the small house, a respected elder, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes still as clear as a winter sky. The town looked after her, bringing her food and firewood, their actions a continuous thank you for the lives she had saved. She was a living monument to the power of quiet persistence. She died in her sleep on the first night of winter, 40 years after the great storm. She was 82 years old. The entire town and the children and grandchildren of those she had sheltered came to her funeral. They buried her on the hill beside Liam and Silas. The town council commissioned a bronze plaque. They didn't place it at the cemetery. They affixed it to the heavy oak door of the shelter, which was still maintained, still stocked, still ready. The plaque was simple. It listed the dates of the disasters: the blizzard of '88, the flood of '05, the fire of '14. Below the dates, there was no grand epitaph, no flowery praise. There were only the 5 words she had spoken to every skeptic, every doubter, every frightened neighbor. The 5 words that had been her shield, her creed, and her promise. I have a plan. It will work. The house stood for another 100 years before it was finally claimed by time. But the porch was always maintained. The entrance to the shelter was never blocked. Long after the names of Ilara and Abernathy and Sterling were forgotten, the children of Blackwood Creek would run their fingers over the cool bronze of the plaque. They would feel the solid earth beneath their feet and know they were safe, protected by a quiet wisdom that had been dug from the dirt, one shovelful at a time. The shelter remained, a silent, waiting lung in the heart of the earth.